Now, of course, Goodman is aware that this flies in the face of common sense. Most people will assume, surely, right? Surely one of the two conflicting versions must be false. But what's motivating this? What Goodman thinks is motivating the objection to this is that there is this intuition that there just must be a version independent truth maker. There must be a way the world is independently of any given version. And Goodman insists, no, right? There just is no ready-made world. There is no world independent of our constructive activity. What, after all, could this version-independent world, which decides the truth between different versions, be like? To say anything about the world, to classify it, to distinguish its kinds and properties, is already to construct a version. We have no choice but to use versions in order to conceptualize anything. Versions carve out the individuals, kinds, properties, and so on. We've already seen how the properties that we attribute to a given object, and even the question of what constitutes an object and how many objects there are, that's all dependent on the version. So, in the absence of any version, the world is devoid of individuals, kinds, properties, relations, structure, which is to say, it's nothing. To be clear, it's not simply that we can't access a world independent of versions, it's that there simply is no such thing. And there is, it's just nothing, because in order to even in order for the world to have any properties at all, right, there would have to be a version that carves it up in a particular way. So here's an everyday example. Goodman asks us to imagine that he's sitting in a waiting room, and looking around the room he finds various things, and I quote, he says, "I make out 2 speakers built into the bookcase, a receiver and a turntable in the corner cabinet, and a remote control switch on the mantel. I find a system that was already there." So he found something that was already there, specifically a stereo system. Okay, we might think the world contains a stereo system, and that's the case independently of what anybody thinks about it. There is a version independent world in which there is this thing, a stereo system, and when Goodman was sitting in the waiting room and he looked around, he found that system in the world, and that was ready-made, and that was version independent. But now Goodman says, well, consider what he actually has to do in order to find this stereo system. He must distinguish various components from their surroundings. He must, draw lines around particular objects. He must categorize them by their functions, and then he must unite them into a whole. So he has to draw boundaries between, so when he sees the remote control switch on the mantle, he has to draw a boundary around that, and then he has to unite all of these different things together. And take them into a whole, a single thing, the stereo system. And that's something that he is doing. It is not something that the world does. This is a constructive activity. And by contrast, says Goodman, he says, another visitor, fresh from a lifetime in the deepest jungle, will not find, because he has not the means of making, any stereo system in the room. So, it's not just that the visitor from the jungle doesn't know what the stereo system is or what it does. He won't even recognize any single unified object. He won't see anything, corresponding to the stereo system. The visitor from the jungle does not find the stereo system in the room because he does not make it. And so it is, Goodman says, with all of the other things in the world. Whatever we find in the world are things that we make through our cognitive activity of, categorizing, drawing boundaries, cutting things up, uniting things. And these are things that we do. These are not things that occur in the world. I just might mention, because it might be of interest at this point, I do have a video called Classification and Kinds, an Anti-Realist View, which I uploaded quite recently. And that goes into a bit more detail on these kind of constructive processes in marking out kinds, in carving up the world. And so that might be an interesting point of connection here that takes a more specifically philosophy of science approach. Anyway, we have the primary argument on the table then. That's Goodman's world making. It is worth just clarifying one aspect of Goodman's view here. So we make worlds, Goodman says, by making versions. But this, of course, raises the question of, well, what exactly is the relationship between versions and worlds? Israel Scheffler, in his article The Wonderful Worlds of Goodman, notes that there are two ways to interpret Goodman's talk of worlds. First, there is the versional interpretation. On the versional interpretation, a world just is a right version. Worlds are straightforwardly identified with particular versions. So the idea is that, look, we construct various representations. Some of these representations meet the criteria for truth or rightness, and these representations just are worlds. Second, there is the objectual interpretation, which holds that a world is a realm of things that is referred to by a right version. So versions represent a world which is separate from themselves. To each right version there corresponds a world. So it's not that right versions just are worlds, but rather right versions answer to or correspond to worlds. Okay, so Goodman does sometimes write things that are ambiguous between these different views. In fact, sometimes Goodman writes as if worlds just are versions, and so that would seem to favour the versional interpretation. But it is generally accepted that Goodman, if he's being more precise, is committed to the objectual interpretation. So when he's speaking carefully, Goodman seems to endorse the objectual interpretation. Recall that a version is a representation. It's a symbol system, and as such, versions and worlds have quite different properties. As Goodman puts it in his article on star making, a version and its world are different. A version saying that there is a star up there is not itself bright or far off, and the star is not made up of letters. Right. As we've said, right, we have versions which describe the motions of celestial bodies. Obviously, those versions are representations, and as such, they're not themselves moving in space. They're not shining brightly in space. They're things that we've constructed in our minds. The world, on the other hand, is not made up of letters and sounds and so on. To say that a world just is a version, that would be to conflate language with what it is that the language describes, which for Goodman would be an obvious confusion. Worlds and versions have different properties. Versions are systems of symbols in our minds. Worlds are ontological realms. So when Goodman says that versions make worlds, he's not simply saying like, oh, we have these various representations in our minds, and then some of these representations meet the criteria for truth or something. That's not what he's saying. He's saying quite literally, right? In virtue of constructing versions, we literally make the ontological realm. We literally make things. Versions and worlds are different, right? Versions are systems of symbols. Worlds are ontological realms. But having said that, obviously, so it is important to bear in mind, versions and worlds are very closely intertwined because worlds do not exist independently of versions. Indeed, we can't conceive of a representation of the world on the one hand against the world itself on the other, because the world itself is always understood via some representation. The worlds that we talk about and act in cannot be conceived independently of the versions that refer to them. That's one of the key ideas of world making. If there is no version, there is no world, and vice versa. There are no worlds without corresponding true versions, and no true versions without corresponding worlds that make those versions true. Hopefully that makes sense. As I say, it is quite a radical position. but yeah, hopefully that makes sense. We construct in our minds these representations, right, and they correspond to ontological realms, but those ontological realms, those realms of things, are themselves made by our representations. Okay then. So I think that pretty much lays out Goodman's position in hopefully some detail. Let's turn to some objections. Well, I suppose the first objection is what, in a slightly different context, David Lewis called the incredulous stare. David Lewis defended modal realism, and modal realism was considered by many people to be completely absurd, and so they reacted to it with what he called an incredulous stare. I have several videos on modal realism if you're interested in that view, but that's not the topic today. So anyway, the incredulous stare may also be given to Goodman. Surely, the objector will say, surely you cannot mean that we literally live in different worlds and that these worlds are literally made by us. That position commits you to a radical relativism, radical constructivism. It's just so absurd, so completely counterintuitive that it's unacceptable. And of course, that's not an argument, so there's not much that can really be said in response. But you know, there's there are other concerns, you know, around the same area here. If Goodman really is committed to this radical relativism, radical constructivism, if Goodman is saying that, like, we just, you know, we make the worlds that we live in, you know, in the current climate, that maybe is a dangerous claim to make. Increasingly, people seem to be less and less concerned with truth and fact and, you know, reality. So think about Donald Trump when he claimed that the crowd at his inauguration was bigger than Obama's, despite the existence of photographs which obviously refuted this. Yeah, like you could just see in the photographs that the crowd at his inauguration was smaller. So, you know, could somebody like Trump say, well, you know, that's just my world version. That's the world that I have made. That's true for me. It is true for me that the crowd at my inauguration was larger. And hey, look, I have this philosophical position developed by Nelson Goodman which backs up what I am saying, because I can make the world this way. So, I think Goodman would rightly question then whether his position is really as counterintuitive as it seems, at least in this particular respect. So, the first point is that Goodman's position is not that the world is whatever way you believe it to be. Remember, for Goodman, only true versions correspond to worlds, and not all versions are true versions. The claim that I am a billionaire, for instance, is just false. There's no world in which I am a billionaire. I may well believe that I am a billionaire, but I will soon find myself frustrated, as you know, if I attempt to purchase a mansion or something, I'm going to find my goals. I'm not going to be able to achieve my goals. And so, you know, it's the same is going to be true for somebody like Donald Trump making claims about the size of the inauguration. Like, they're just like, no, that inauguration was it was smaller. You can apply whatever system for like counting people that you want, but as long as you apply the same system to both inaugurations, then, you know, we can make claims about which was bigger and which was smaller, and you know, that's that. Donald Trump was just wrong in what he said. In general, world making is difficult. Cognitive construction often fails. You only have to look at the litany of failed theories in the history of science to see that. In order for a version to be true, and so for a world to be made, there are strict constraints. The version must be internally incoherent, or rather, it must be internally coherent, not internally incoherent. Incoherency is something that you really want to avoid when you're making a version. So, yeah, it must be internally coherent. It must be practically applicable. It must be successful in, achieving the epistemic goals. It must have theoretical virtues like simplicity and explanatory scope and so on. And it's not easy to make a version that meets those criteria. So furthermore, when we make true versions, the truths are in an important sense independent of the maker. So it's much the same as with anything else that we construct. There are many things that we uncontroversially make. We make tables and chairs and cars, right? Nobody would deny that. Nobody would deny that the table is something that's made by us. Yet the fact that we make these things does not preclude us from taking statements about tables and chairs to be true independently of any given person's opinion. The statements like there are 3 tables in this room and some chairs are combustible, well, those are true or false depending on the way the world is, even though we have made the world that way in an uncontroversial sense, right? We have brought the tables into existence, we have put them where they are. I might believe that there are 3 tables in the room when actually there are only 2. Indeed, everybody might believe that there are 3 tables in the room when actually there are only 2. And it's essentially the same with conceptual world making. Once we construct a particular version, once we have a particular way of carving up the world, that's going to generate truths that are in a sense independent of what we believe, in that our beliefs could be just wrong. We might have made the truths, but we can still be mistaken about what the truths that we have made are. So with these points in mind, Goodman's view may not be as extreme as it initially seems. He's not saying that people can just believe whatever they want. And as far as Goodman is concerned, truth and fact, they're still important. Now, it is true that Goodman is a relativist and a constructivist. And yeah, I mean, these aspects of his position are unpopular. It's not clear that there are knockdown arguments against them, though. So I do have a video on relativism, so I won't go into the whole debate about relativism here. Obviously, since Goodman adopts a kind of relativism, the objections to relativism can apply to his position as well. But I have a whole video on that, so you can check out that if you are interested. Okay, so anyway, the point for now is just, there are factors of Goodman's position that make it perhaps a bit more plausible than might initially have been thought. So, second objection, discussed by Alexander Deklos in the Goodman's Many Worlds article, is the logical objection. What exactly do we mean when we talk about the world? Well, in metaphysics, the world, by definition, is a maximally inclusive whole. It is the totality of all that there is. The world consists of all things that actually exist. And so that is, anything that exists is either part of the world or is just the world itself. There's nothing outside of the world. Now, if the world consists of all things that exist, then there just cannot, by definition, be several actual worlds. Right? That's just a basic logical error. Now, of course, the question here is how we define the term world. And that's actually something that is in question within metaphysics. If we suppose that world refers to everything there is, then not only Goodman's world making, but also David Lewis's modal realism becomes impossible to state. In fact, though, it is worth noting Goodman was actually quite happy to just accept the logical objection. He says that if we want to speak of worlds at all, then there are many worlds. But he also says that there's a sense in which if there are many worlds, then there are none. Precisely because we use the term world to refer to all that there is. So in that case, he says, talk of worlds just dissolves into talk of versions. If we want to use the term world in the sense of the metaphysicians, then, actually turns out there are no worlds. But that's not how Goodman usually uses the term. Deklos suggests that one way to deal with the logical objection is to draw a distinction between the metaphysical use of world, where world is defined to mean everything there is, and what he calls the schematic use. So schematically, the term world designates a particular ontological realm, depending on the context. Think, for instance, of when historians talk about the medieval world, referring to a set of things existing in a particular place over a particular period of time, or the physical world, referring to the objects and events described by physical theories. On the schematic use, the term world is a context-dependent term which picks out the whole domain of discourse of a sentence within a particular context. So the idea is this, right? The world refers to a totality, but, totality of what? Well, that's going to be determined by the world version. So we can read Goodman like this. Consider some version V and a corresponding world W, which we take V to describe. Well, then the idea is that everything that W contains may be described by the use of V. There's nothing in W that is not captured in V. So from the point of view of V, what exists in W is all there is. And obviously other versions will make other worlds, but from the point of view of V, right, V captures all that there is. The notion of a totality, of capturing everything there is then defined relative to the viewpoint of a given version. Okay, let's turn to what may be a more serious problem. We've seen that Goodman resists the idea of a ready-made world, a world independent of our constructive activities. But if we're talking about world making, well, surely something must be doing the making. There must be something already existent which is there prior to any world making, which can then engage in world making activities. There must be something which is able to conceive, to carve up, to represent, to describe before any world is made. After all, nothing can be a cause of itself, nothing can create itself out of nothing. So if we make the world, there must be something of us already there. And there's another side to this point, because if we make the world, there must be something of the world already there. After all, you can't just will things into existence. Our constructive activity must be applied to some basic stuff, to some basic objects, maybe qualia or sense data, or maybe physical objects or something like that. Whatever, there must be some material, right, that's already there, that's independent of any particular version, for us to work our constructive activity upon, for us to construct with. Again, you can't make something out of nothing. So what we want to say is, look, surely there was something there in the world that existed before anybody picked it out. There had to have been something there. There had to have been, an entity capable of creating versions, and there had to be some sort of material for that entity to work with. Of course, there are many ways in which, yes, we decide which things to focus on and we decide how to draw the lines and so on, but things must already have been there in the world. So what might Goodman say in response to this? Well, Goodman suggests, look, nobody ever comes into the world empty, right? We already inhabit various worlds. Worlds are made by us, but part of the process of being brought up, of learning a language and learning how to classify the things around you, this is to be inculcated with various versions of your culture. So world making is always a matter of improving the versions that others have made. It's always a matter of constructing new worlds out of the scrap of old ones. As Robert Schwartz in his article Starting from Scratch puts it, world making is always remaking. And of course, in different contexts, different things will be found made by others, but there are never any privileged building blocks. It's not so like, yes, I come into the world, and as I'm brought up, as my various perceptual and other cognitive capacities develop, I'm inculcated with these various world versions, and so I'm not making a world out of nothing, right? It's just that there are already world versions there that I'm brought up in, and so when I make the world, I'm remaking on the basis of these versions that were already made by others. So for those who insist that there is a version-independent world, Goodman has a simple challenge. He says, okay, tell me what it is. Right? What kinds, what properties, what features, what relations in the world exist independently of our versions? And Goodman gives a nice discussion here of stellar constellations. It's not so controversial to suppose that we carve up the night sky into constellations. Constellations are the sort of thing that, it seems pretty plausible, I think, that we construct the constellations. So, the Big Dipper, say. Does the Big Dipper exist independently of any version, independently of our choosing to draw particular boundaries around the stars? Well, we might say something like this. All configurations of stars are at least potential constellations, and we picked out one of those configurations and we called it the Big Dipper. Now, of course, it wasn't called the Big Dipper before we picked it out, and there wasn't anything special about it as a configuration before we picked it out, but it was still there, right? That configuration of stars existed independently in the world, right? There was a group of stars organized in a particular way. We created a version in which a group of stars is metaphorically a Big Dipper, but we didn't create that configuration of stars. So, what is the thing that was made by nature, that was ready-made there for us to pick out? Well, it was a particular configuration of stars, right? That was what was given by the world, was the configuration of stars. But wait, Goodman says, just as we designate particular things as constellations by choosing to draw lines around particular configurations, by choosing to mark off boundaries in a special way, so it is with the stars themselves. Nothing could count as a star if not for us choosing to draw boundaries around individual entities. So, we mark off particular balls of gas from the rest of space. That's the first thing we have to do. And then we have to draw boundaries around groups of those entities in such a way as to distinguish them from other kinds of things. So we distinguish stars from planets based on whether the entity is capable of thermonuclear fusion. But we have to choose where to mark the boundaries. Metaphysically then, right, there isn't really a difference between stars and constellations, at least according to Goodman. Even in the case of the configuration of stars, right, that's something that's there because we have marked things out. We have chosen to draw boundaries in a particular way. There is a residual worry here, though. Versions are constructed by us, but stars existed long before humans turned up. So stars existed long before the versions that supposedly made them. How does that make sense? Indeed, we might worry that there's just an incoherence in Goodman's view here. Goodman says that worlds are made by versions, and he denies that there is any ready-made world, any world that is independent of versions, there to be found by us. But our best versions tell us that stars existed long before we did. Stars existed prior to versions. So, according to our very versions, right, there is a world independent of versions, a world that existed before the versions did. Well, Goodman's answer to this is that versions can carve up things of the past and future as well as things of the present. Just as a version can make what is far away in space, so it can make what is far away in time. Indeed, space and time are themselves constructed by versions just like everything else. Space and time, are initially made by versions that distribute things in space and time. And once we have a space-time, then if a version goes on to carve out constellations, say, or stars, then we can project those things back into the past. Maybe with some change, almost certainly with some changes. Obviously stars move and so on, but the point is we are still carving things out in a particular way, and we're projecting that onto the past, just as we project it onto distances that are far away. Okay, another objection. Andrei Kukla, in his book Social Constructivism in the Philosophy of Science, raises a problem that we can call the problem of the interworld lunch. Goodman says that there are many actual worlds, and we can occupy different worlds at different times. We move from one world to another as we make the world in different ways. Now, what is the relationship between these worlds? Whatever it is, it isn't a relationship of standard spatio-temporal connections. It's not as if there are a load of different worlds scattered through space-time like planets scattered through a solar system. Indeed, as Goodman himself notes, in saying that there is a world where the Earth is at rest and a world where the Earth moves, obviously we're not supposing that there are literally a bunch of different Earths all in the same solar system, potentially risking collision. That's not what's being said. So worlds are not distributed in space-time, they're not spatio-temporally connected, at least not in any obvious way. But if we deny spatio-temporal connection, we have a problem. If people inhabit different worlds, and if there's no spatio-temporal connections between worlds, how can we all get together and have lunch, right? How can we all get together and discuss our various views? How can we move from one world to another? How can there be a common venue that we may all enter for discussion, in which discussion can occur? I mean, the point is, it looks like Goodman needs there to be some sense in which worlds overlap, because, otherwise there's no way for us to have lunch together. But how do we make sense of this overlap, if not in terms of spatio-temporal relations? Now, of course, one response to this would be to just deny that there is any sense in which worlds overlap, and just say, actually, no, we just live in completely different worlds, and we never really interact with anyone else. Obviously, that would be a fairly radical conclusion, a sort of strange kind of many worlds solipsism. Indeed, it's not clear that would even be coherent for Goodman to take this position, because, after all, right, I have constructed a world that contains you, and you have constructed a world. Okay. I have constructed a world that contains you, and you have constructed a world in which I have just sneezed. So even if we just take like your world version, well, that world version already has me in it, and my world version already has you in it. So, I have a world version which has me having lunch with people who have different world versions. So, and of course Goodman not only wants to say that different people can interact, he also wants to say that a single individual can inhabit different worlds at different times. We can, move from one version to another. So there needs to be some sort of overlap between these worlds. The worry then is that Goodman just doesn't have a coherent model of worlds. And that's not to say that it's incoherent, it's to say that there is work to be done. It's not obvious that his position is coherent, because the most obvious way of understanding Goodman's many worlds as totalities without spatio-temporal relations, well, actually that turns out to be problematic, because then we have this problem of accounting for overlap. Right, here is a final concern. Goodman's claim is that worlds are made by true versions. But what if there are no true versions? I mean, we've already discussed how world making is extremely difficult. It's subject to very strong constraints, so you can't just believe whatever you want to believe. So certainly Goodman needs it to be subject to very strong constraints in order to avoid endorsing, a completely ridiculous position. Versions need to be internally coherent, empirically adequate, reasonably simple and practical to use, and so on, right? So there are standards by which we judge versions, and there are criteria that versions have to meet in order to be true. But why should we think that any version whatsoever satisfies these criteria, right? Why should we think that we actually have a version that satisfies these? Indeed, why should we think that it's even possible to construct a version that satisfies these criteria? After all, it's a common opinion that even our best theories right now are not perfect. Not even if we restrict their application to particular contexts and goals. Nobody supposes that any particular field of science, say, has reached its end. There will be changes in the future. All our current theories face anomalies and all are incomplete. So even the most militant scientific realist will accept that by whatever standards we use to judge truth, science doesn't deliver the whole truth. It only delivers approximate truth, right? That's what you get from even our best scientific theories, right? Is they're not just going to be true in general; they're going to be approximately true. So, do we get true versions even from our best science? I mean, but on Goodman's view, if there are no true versions, there are no worlds, and approximate truth is just a special kind of falsehood, right? To say that something's approximately true is to say it's not true. It's false. It may be close to the truth, but it's not true. And if it's not true, then there's no corresponding world. So maybe Goodman could weaken his claim. Maybe he could say, well, it's not just that worlds are made by true versions, worlds are also made by approximately true versions. Now this move raises some serious problems because, so as I've said, to say that something is approximately true is to say that it's not true, it's false. But then if we say that there is a version that makes a world, that there is a world that the version answers to or that it corresponds to, in what sense could it be false? After all, it's true of its world, right? I mean, that's the nature of the relation between versions and the worlds they make, is that versions just are true of their worlds. So if we say that approximately true versions make worlds, then now we need to account for how this version could actually be false but still have a world. So there are some difficulties here in explaining what we do in a situation where actually arguably we just don't have true versions. That may be a problem for Goodman. Okay, that's all. That's Goodman's Worldmaking and some of the objections to it. I hope you found that interesting, and that's all for today. Goodbye.